If you want to protect your health for the long haul, here's a simple rule worth considering. Be wary of anything that wouldn't have appeared on a dinner table a century ago. I know that's not what the major food manufacturers want to hear, but the evidence keeps pointing in that direction. In my years working alongside patients dealing with chronic metabolic conditions, I've watched an overwhelming number of people arrive with complications tied to elevated blood sugar, cardiovascular strain, and circulatory emergencies, conditions that in most cases could have been avoided entirely. And despite everything modern medicine has achieved, these numbers keep climbing rather than falling. When you step back and ask what has truly shifted over the last 100 years, a troubling pattern starts to emerge. Food producers and policymakers, regardless of their politics, have too often placed profit ahead of public well-being. And since our health is so deeply tied to the environment we live in and the food we have access to, that imbalance shows up in our bodies. There's a substance quietly woven into a huge portion of the food we eat that simply didn't exist in our pantries a century ago. It won't show up on a label as sugar. You won't detect it on your tongue. And yet it has the ability to send your blood glucose soaring faster than a spoonful of ordinary table sugar would. If you've eliminated sugar from your diet but your glucose readings are still unpredictable, this hidden ingredient may be the reason why. So what exactly is this substance? We're talking about heavily processed, refined starches, ingredients like maltodextrin, cornstarch, and modified food starch. These aren't whole foods in any sense. They're not the potato, the grain of rice, or the bowl of oats you might picture. They are manufactured additives, engineered during industrial food processing, and they show up in an astonishing number of products lining store shelves. Most people have never even heard these names because they're tucked away in fine print, buried in ingredient lists, hiding in a spot most shoppers never think to check. That's what makes this issue so deceptive. These compounds are essentially invisible to anyone who's simply trying to eat responsibly. Picture yourself standing in the grocery aisle, scanning a label for carbohydrate and sugar content. You spot a line that reads "of which sugars" and see a low number, maybe even 0, and you feel confident in your choice. But that very same product might contain maltodextrin or a modified starch, and physiologically, your body will respond to it in a way that's nearly identical to consuming straight sugar, sometimes even more intensely. This blind spot exists because of how nutrition labels are structured. Carbohydrates are listed as a total, and beneath that total, only the sugar portion is broken out separately. Refined starches like maltodextrin fall under the broader carbohydrate category, but they're never counted as sugar, even though your bloodstream treats them exactly the same way. That means a product can proudly advertise itself as sugar-free, while still triggering a dramatic spike in your glucose levels, simply because the starch inside it isn't legally classified as sugar. Now let's talk about what's actually happening inside your body when this occurs. The moment you consume maltodextrin, your digestive system breaks it down into glucose almost instantly. And speed is the critical factor here. Maltodextrin converts to glucose faster than most other carbohydrates you could name. Your blood sugar climbs rapidly. Your pancreas responds by releasing insulin to manage the surge. The end result is a metabolic reaction nearly indistinguishable from eating a spoonful of refined sugar directly. In fact, when researchers measure the glycemic index of maltodextrin, a scale that shows how quickly a food raises blood glucose, it frequently scores higher than table sugar itself. So sugar-free absolutely does not translate to glucose-friendly. That distinction matters more than most people realize. Let's break this down in plain terms. Starch, at its core, is simply a chain of glucose molecules bonded together. Whenever you eat any starch, your digestive system has to unlock that chain to release the glucose for absorption. How fast that breakdown happens depends heavily on the starch's natural structure and what other nutrients are present alongside it. Industrial processing does something quite drastic to that structure. It strips away the fiber. It dismantles the natural architecture of the food. And in doing so, it transforms what would have been a slow, steady release of energy into something that digests almost instantaneously. The result is a flood of glucose entering your bloodstream at a pace your body was never built to handle on a regular basis. Your pancreas compensates by releasing a large burst of insulin to pull that glucose back out of circulation. This is the exact same hormonal chain reaction triggered by eating candy, drinking a sugary soda, or having a slice of cake. Processing has essentially converted a complex carbohydrate into something your body treats like simple sugar, even though on a chemical level, it technically remains starch. Here's why this truly matters. Your body doesn't read ingredient labels. It has no idea whether the glucose flooding your bloodstream came from a chocolate bar or from a health food bar containing maltodextrin. The physiological outcome is identical either way. A sharp spike, a strong insulin surge, and then an energy crash as your blood sugar comes plummeting back down. And this is perhaps the most unsettling part of the entire picture. These refined starches aren't lurking exclusively in obvious junk food. They're embedded in products marketed specifically to health-conscious consumers. Protein bars are a textbook example, and many of us have reached for one at some point believing we were making a smart choice. You check the sugar line, it looks reasonable, but then you glance at the ingredient list, and there it is, maltodextrin sitting near the very top. The same story plays out with meal replacement shakes, certain popular brands that market themselves as diet-friendly, low-fat yogurts, bottled sauces, salad dressings, and even some protein powders and supplements. Manufacturers rely on these ingredients because they're inexpensive to produce, they improve texture and mouthfeel, and they significantly extend shelf life. From a business standpoint, it's a brilliant strategy. From a metabolic health standpoint, it's a quiet catastrophe. People believe they're making thoughtful choices, avoiding added sugar, reading labels diligently, while unknowingly consuming the very ingredients driving the metabolic problems they're trying to escape. Your blood sugar has no way of distinguishing a protein bar from a pastry. Now, before anyone decides to swear off carbohydrates altogether, it's important to draw a firm line between these manufactured starches and the starches found in whole, natural foods. Potatoes, lentils, oats, beans, and whole grains all contain starch too, but they arrive in a completely different package. They come bundled with fiber, which plays an enormous protective role. Their cellular structure remains intact, and as a result, they digest far more gradually. That fiber slows glucose absorption. The intact structure takes time for your body to break down, and the overall impact on your blood sugar is dramatically gentler. That's why a bowl of oats in the morning can leave you feeling satisfied and steady for a good stretch of time. Not quite as long as a meal built around protein and healthy fats, but steady nonetheless. Compare that to a healthy muffin loaded with refined flour and maltodextrin, which give you a quick jolt of energy followed by an abrupt crash. Same basic macronutrient, completely different metabolic story. Processing, far more than the carbohydrate itself, is what determines the outcome. If this were only about a temporary energy slump, it would be a minor annoyance. But the real danger lies in what happens when these spikes repeat themselves day after day, year after year. Each time your glucose surges, your pancreas answers with another wave of insulin. Insulin's job is to usher that glucose out of your bloodstream and into your cells for storage or use. But when this cycle repeats constantly, your cells gradually become less responsive to insulin's signal. This is what's known as insulin resistance, and it sits at the root of type 2 diabetes, obesity, fatty liver disease, and a whole cluster of related metabolic conditions. What makes insulin resistance especially concerning is that insulin doesn't only regulate blood sugar. It also functions as your body's primary storage hormone. When insulin levels stay elevated, your body remains locked in storage mode, making it extremely difficult to burn fat for energy. So if you're someone who snacks frequently on bars, shakes, or so-called healthy convenience foods packed with maltodextrin, your insulin levels may never fully settle down. You end up trapped in a state where fat burning becomes nearly impossible, and you're inching closer to insulin resistance without ever realizing it. This exact pattern shows up again and again in the people I meet in clinical settings. They arrive dealing with the downstream effects of poorly managed blood sugar, and when we walk through their daily eating habits together, a familiar story unfolds. They've been diligently avoiding added sugar. They've been trying to make responsible choices. And yet, without knowing it, they've been consuming hidden refined starches that have been quietly undermining their metabolic health the entire time. So what can you actually do with this information? The first step is learning to read ingredient lists with a sharper eye, not just scanning for the word sugar, but watching for maltodextrin, modified food starch, and corn syrup. If any of these appear near the top of an ingredient list, treat that as a warning sign, regardless of how low the sugar count looks. Second, lean toward whole, minimally processed foods whenever you can. Reach for nuts, cheese, fresh fruit, or whole food carbohydrates like sweet potatoes and oats instead of packaged snack bars. If you do occasionally reach for a protein bar, that's not the end of the world. Just recognize it for what it is, a convenient processed snack, not a health food in itself. And if you use protein powders or meal replacement shakes, look for options built around whole food carbohydrate sources rather than industrial starches, keeping in mind that even the better options aren't a substitute for real food. Third, whenever you do eat carbohydrates, pair them with fiber and protein. This simple habit slows digestion and softens the glucose response considerably. A baked potato served with tuna and a side salad creates a completely different metabolic experience than a refined flour muffin loaded with maltodextrin, even if the numbers on the label look deceptively similar. At the end of the day, this isn't about demonizing sugar or fearing carbohydrates as a category. It's about understanding what's actually entering your bloodstream and how your body responds once it gets there. The food industry has become remarkably skilled at engineering products that appear wholesome on paper while creating real metabolic strain in practice. Maltodextrin and its relatives are just one piece of that puzzle, but they matter enormously because they're so widespread and so easily overlooked. If there's a single takeaway here, let it be this: processing changes everything. You don't need to fear carbohydrates themselves, but you do need to pay close attention to how they're packaged and delivered. Whole foods, natural fiber, protein, and healthy fats are what protect your body from the chaos of repeated blood sugar spikes. Industrial ingredients engineered purely for shelf life and profit margins were never designed with your well-being in mind. And the more clearly you can see that, the more power you have to protect your own health, one informed choice at a time.